The sleek black BMW rolled smoothly down Maple Avenue in the upscale Oakwood Heights neighborhood. The late afternoon sun glinted off its polished surface as it moved at exactly the speed limit. Behind the wheel sat Dr. Amara Johnson, exhausted after a long day of meetings, but still looking every bit the professional in her navy blue suit. She'd just been appointed as the head of internal affairs for the city's police department last week, and the weight of the new responsibility sat heavy on her shoulders. Dr. Johnson turned down the volume on the jazz station playing softly through her speakers. This neighborhood was new to her. Tree-lined streets with sprawling houses set back on manicured lawns. She drove carefully, taking in the sights, mentally mapping the area as part of her personal project to better understand every corner of the city she now served. In her rearview mirror, blue lights suddenly flashed. Dr. Johnson checked her speedometer, exactly 25 miles per hour in a 25 zone. She hadn't run any stop signs, used her phone, or broken any traffic laws. With a sigh that came from years of similar experiences, she signaled and pulled over to the curb beneath a towering oak tree. Officer James Reeves had been parked at the corner of Maple and Oak, watching cars pass by on what had been a quiet afternoon. He'd been on the force for 12 years and considered Oakwood Heights part of his territory. When the BMW with tinted windows drove by, something about it caught his attention. He couldn't put his finger on what seemed off about the vehicle. It wasn't speeding, wasn't swerving, but the driver didn't look like most of the residents he knew in this neighborhood. He pulled out behind the BMW and flipped on his lights. No siren, just the lights. Dr. Johnson lowered all four windows slightly, placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be easily seen, and took a deep breath. She'd been here before many times. As a black woman driving in upscale neighborhoods, getting pulled over for simply being there was nothing new, even at 45 years old with 2 advanced degrees and a spotless driving record. Officer Reeves approached the driver's side window with his right hand resting casually on his holster, a habit he didn't even realize he had developed only with certain drivers. His face wore the stern expression he reserved for people he considered suspicious. License and registration, he demanded without preamble, no greeting, no explanation for the stop. His tone was sharp, impatient. "Good afternoon, officer," Dr. Johnson replied calmly. "May I ask why I've been pulled over?" Reeves' expression hardened. "License and registration first, then we'll get to that." Dr. Johnson nodded. "I'm going to reach for my purse on the passenger seat to get my wallet. Is that okay?" Reeves nodded curtly, watching her every move with narrowed eyes. With deliberate slowness, Dr. Johnson retrieved her license and registration, handing them over while maintaining her composure. Years of experience had taught her that showing any hint of frustration could escalate these situations. Officer Reeves glanced at her license, then back at her face, as if confirming she matched the photo. "So, Dr. Johnson, what brings you to this neighborhood? You don't live around here." "I'm familiarizing myself with different areas of the city," she answered honestly. "It's part of my new job." "And what job would that be?" His tone suggested disbelief. "I work for the city," she replied simply. While Officer Reeves ran her information through the system, Dr. Johnson discreetly reached for her phone and activated the voice recording app. Another habit born from experience. Reeves returned, still looking suspicious. "Your record's clean, but you still haven't explained what you're really doing here. We've had reports of suspicious vehicles in the area." Dr. Johnson knew there had been no such reports. This was a fishing expedition, one she'd experienced many times before. "Officer," she said calmly, "I believe I've answered your question. I'm driving through the neighborhood as part of my job, familiarizing myself with the city. I wasn't speeding or breaking any traffic laws. So again, may I ask why you pulled me over today?" Reeves shifted uncomfortably, his hand still resting near his weapon. "You were driving suspiciously." "In what way?" She pressed gently. "Too slow, like you were casing houses," he said, the excuse sounding hollow even to his own ears. Dr. Johnson nodded slowly, making a mental note of his badge number, 4572, Officer James Reeves. This wouldn't be the last time they'd meet. Dr. Johnson sat perfectly still as Officer Reeves studied her license and registration. The tension in the air was thick enough to touch. A jogger passed by, slowing down slightly to peer at the scene before continuing on their way. Dr. Johnson noticed the curious glance but kept her focus on the officer. "So you're a doctor?" Reeves asked, his tone suggesting disbelief. "What kind of doctor drives around fancy neighborhoods in the middle of a workday?" "I have a PhD in criminal justice," Dr. Johnson replied evenly. "And as I mentioned, I'm driving through different neighborhoods as part of my new position with the city." Officer Reeves leaned down, resting his forearm on the car door. His position was deliberately intimidating, looming over her. "And what exactly is this city job that lets you cruise around all day?" Dr. Johnson took a slow, measured breath. Her phone continued recording the conversation from where she placed it in the cup holder. She'd been in enough of these situations to know documentation was her best protection. "I oversee departmental operations and review procedural compliance," she answered, intentionally keeping her response vague but truthful. Years of experience had taught her that revealing too much too soon often made these encounters worse, not better. "That's a fancy way of saying what exactly?" Reeves pressed, his eyes scanning the interior of her car. "Mind if I have a look in your trunk?" "Yes, I do mind," Dr. Johnson replied firmly but politely. "Officer Reeves, I've provided my identification, explained my presence in the neighborhood, and answered your questions. I was driving within the speed limit and breaking no laws. Unless you're detaining me for a specific violation, I'd like to be on my way." The use of his name caught him off guard. His eyes flicked down to his nameplate, then back to her face. His jaw tightened. "How do you know my name?" Suspicion deepened in his voice. "It's on your uniform," she pointed out calmly. "Badge number 4572, Officer James Reeves." A car drove by slowly, the driver openly watching the scene. Dr. Johnson recognized the Neighborhood Association sticker on their windshield. This was exactly the kind of community where residents noticed everything out of the ordinary. "Step out of the vehicle, please," Reeves ordered suddenly. "On what grounds, Officer Reeves?" Her voice remained steady, though her heart rate had picked up. "I need to verify that you haven't been drinking. You're acting suspiciously." Dr. Johnson knew this tactic well. The escalation when initial questioning didn't yield the results the officer wanted. She also knew her rights. "I haven't consumed any alcohol today," she stated clearly. "My speech is not slurred, I'm not exhibiting any signs of impairment, and you had no cause to pull me over in the first place. Unless you have reasonable suspicion that I'm under the influence, I'm not required to submit to field sobriety tests." Reeves' face flushed slightly. He wasn't used to people who knew the law as well as he did, or better. "Look," he said, his tone shifting to one of exasperated authority, "we've had break-ins in this neighborhood. People who don't belong here coming around, looking for opportunities. I'm just doing my job." Dr. Johnson noted his choice of words. "People who don't belong here." She decided it was time. "Officer Reeves," she said, reaching slowly toward the glove compartment, "I'm going to take out something that I think might help clarify this situation." "Keep your hands where I can see them," he ordered sharply. "I'm simply retrieving my official identification," she explained, moving with deliberate slowness. "I'd like you to see it." Reluctantly, Reeves nodded, his posture tense. Dr. Johnson opened the glove compartment and removed a leather wallet different from the one containing her driver's license. She flipped it open to reveal a gold badge and ID card. "My complete identification," she said, handing it to him. "As I mentioned, I do work for the city. Specifically, I'm Dr. Amara Johnson, the newly appointed head of internal affairs for the police department." Reeves took the ID, his eyes widening as he read the credentials. The color drained from his face as realization dawned. His hand, which had been resting near his holster throughout their exchange, suddenly dropped to his side. I wasn't aware," he stammered, his entire demeanor transforming in an instant. Clearly, Dr. Johnson replied quietly. "Now, am I free to go, Officer Reeves? Or is there something else you need from me today?" Captain Rivera closed the door to Dr. Johnson's office and took a seat across from her desk. He was a veteran officer with 23 years on the force, his salt and pepper hair and the deep lines around his eyes, telling stories of countless long shifts. "So you had a run-in with Reeves," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I wish I could say I'm surprised." Dr. Johnson pushed a folder across her desk. "His record shows a pattern. 6 complaints in 12 years, all from minority citizens, all dismissed. She tapped her finger on the closed folder. What those files don't show is how quickly he changed his tune when he realized who I was. Reeves has always been. Rivera paused, searching for the right words. Let's just say he's old school. Sees the world in black and white. In his mind, there are good guys and bad guys, and he thinks he can tell the difference just by looking. That's exactly the problem, Captain. Dr. Johnson played the recording of the stop. Rivera's expression darkened as he listened to the escalating tension in his officer's voice, the baseless accusations, and then the sudden change when Reeves discovered Dr. Johnson's identity. I've had enough, Rivera said, raising his hand before the recording finished. What are you planning to do? Dr. Johnson turned off the playback. That depends. Tell me honestly, is Reeves an outlier, or is he symptom of a larger issue in the department? Rivera's silence told her everything. I thought so, she said. I didn't take this job to fire cops, Captain. I took it to make this department better. She stood up and walked to the window overlooking the city. I need your help with something. By the time Officer Reeves arrived at headquarters the next morning for his shift, rumors had already spread. The new IA chief had been pulled over by a cop who didn't know who she was. Some versions claimed she was going to fire him on the spot. Others said she was preparing a department-wide purge. Reeves tried to ignore the whispers and stares as he changed into his uniform. His locker neighbor, Officer Patel, gave him a sympathetic look. Rough break, man, Patel said. Any idea what's going to happen? Before Reeves could answer, his radio crackled. Officer Reeves, report to the watch commander's office immediately. The walk to Lieutenant Wilson's office felt like the longest of his life. Each step echoed in the hallway. Officers he passed gave him a wide berth, as if his misfortune might be contagious. He knocked on the lieutenant's door, heart pounding in his chest. Come in, Wilson called. Reeves entered to find not just Wilson, but Captain Rivera and Dr. Johnson waiting for him. The room suddenly felt too small, the air too thin. Officer Reeves, Wilson said, his voice unusually formal. You're being temporarily reassigned. Reassigned? Reeves repeated, a cold feeling spreading through his stomach. To where? To me. Dr. Johnson answered, for the next 2 weeks, you'll be assisting Internal Affairs with a special project. Reeves looked from face to face, trying to read their expressions. Is this a punishment? That depends on your perspective, Dr. Johnson said. Report to the IA office at 900 hours tomorrow. Bring your patrol records for the past 6 months. She stood and walked past him to the door. Oh, and Officer Reeves? Don't be late. After she left, Reeves turned to Captain Rivera. Sir, I can explain about yesterday. Rivera held up his hand. Save it, Reeves. You've been given an opportunity here, though God knows why she's offering it to you. I suggest you don't waste it. Back in her office, Dr. Johnson added Reeves' file to a growing stack on her desk. 5 other officers had similar patterns in their records, all with multiple complaints from minority citizens, all dismissed during internal reviews. Together, these 6 officers accounted for over 80% of racial profiling complaints against the department in the past 3 years. Tom knocked and entered with a fresh cup of coffee. The conference room is set up for tomorrow, and I've pulled all the files you requested. He nodded toward the stack. Are you sure about this approach? It's not exactly by the book. Dr. Johnson took the coffee gratefully. The book hasn't been working, Tom. These patterns have persisted for years because we keep handling them the same way. She sipped her coffee, wincing slightly at the heat. Sometimes real change requires a different approach. And if it doesn't work? If Reeves and the others don't respond to your project? Dr. Johnson's expression hardened just slightly. Then they'll face the consequences of their actions, just like anyone else. But I believe in giving people a chance to be better, to do better. She picked up a marker and wrote on her whiteboard in large letters, Project T Mirror. Starting tomorrow, she said, Officer James Reeves is going to see policing from the other side of the badge. Officer Reeves arrived at the Internal Affairs office at 8:45 the next morning, 15 minutes early. He barely slept, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. The IA waiting room was cold and unwelcoming, with hard plastic chairs and outdated magazines no one ever read. A clock on the wall ticked loudly, marking each second of his wait. At precisely 9 o'clock, Tom opened the door. "Dr. Johnson will see you now." Reeves followed him into a large conference room where he found not just Dr. Johnson, but 5 other officers as well. He recognized each of them. Wilson from Traffic, Gonzalez from Vice, Chen from Narcotics, Baker from Patrol, and Thompson from the Gang Unit. They looked as confused as he felt. "Good morning," Dr. Johnson said, standing at the head of the conference table. "You're probably wondering why you're here." "That's putting it mildly," muttered Baker, a 20-year veteran with a perpetual scowl. Dr. Johnson clicked a remote, and a projector displayed a simple chart on the wall. "This represents civilian complaints filed against officers in our department over the past 3 years. The 6 of you account for 83% of all racial profiling complaints." The room went silent. Reeves felt his face grow hot as the other officers glanced at him, then quickly looked away. "Now, I could process these complaints through official channels. Some of you might face suspension. Some might even lose your badges." She set down the remote and looked each officer in the eye. "But I don't believe that would solve our department's problem." "With all due respect," Thompson spoke up, "what exactly is the problem? We work the toughest beats in the city. Complaints come with the territory." Dr. Johnson nodded. "That's why we're here, Officer Thompson, to understand the territory from a different perspective." She passed out thick folders to each officer. "These contain testimonials from citizens in your patrol areas. People who feel they've been unfairly targeted, harassed, or profiled by police." "You want us to read complaint letters?" Gonzalez asked, flipping through her folder with obvious distaste. "I want you to listen," Dr. Johnson corrected. "These aren't just complaints. They're stories, real experiences from real people in our community." She walked around the table, stopping behind Reeves. "Some of these citizens have agreed to meet with us. Starting today, you'll be hearing their stories firsthand." Officer Chen let out a low whistle. "You're making us sit through a victim panel. I thought those were for drunk drivers and domestic abusers." "No one in this room is a victim or an abuser," Dr. Johnson said firmly. "You're officers who've developed patterns of behavior that are damaging the relationship between our department and the community we serve. Project Mirror is about seeing the impact of those behaviors from the other side." As if on cue, the door opened. A middle-aged black man in a business suit entered, followed by an elderly Asian woman and a young Latino man. They took seats at the far end of the table. "These community members have agreed to share their experiences with you," Dr. Johnson explained. "You will listen respectfully, without interrupting or defending. This isn't about making you feel guilty, it's about understanding." For the next 2 hours, Reeves and the other officers sat in uncomfortable silence as the civilians described their encounters with police. The businessman spoke about being pulled over 11 times in a single year while driving his luxury car. The elderly woman described her fear when officers raided her home on a mistaken address. The young man recounted being stopped and searched on his way home from college classes, with officers telling him he didn't look like a student. None of the stories involved extreme violence or blatant abuse, just the small, daily humiliations and suspicions that wore people down over time. The constant assumption of guilt. The unspoken message that they didn't belong in certain neighborhoods or driving certain cars. Reeves stared at his hands as the young man finished speaking. He couldn't help but notice the parallels to his stop with Dr. Johnson. The same assumptions. The same suspicions based on nothing but appearances. When the panel ended, Dr. Johnson thanked the community members and saw them out. She returned to find the 6 officers sitting in silence, the weight of what they'd heard hanging heavy in the room. "That's enough for today," she said quietly. "Tomorrow, we'll be visiting community centers in neighborhoods with high complaint rates. You'll be in plainclothes, observing citizen-police interactions from the community perspective." As the officers filed out, Dr. Johnson called Reeves back. "A moment, officer." He braced himself, expecting a reprimand or worse. "What did you think of today's session?" she asked. Reeves hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "It was uncomfortable." "Good," she replied. "Discomfort is often the first step toward growth. See you tomorrow, Officer Reeves." As he walked to his car in the parking garage, Reeves noticed himself watching how other officers interacted with people on the street. For the first time in his career, he found himself wondering how those interactions felt from the other side. 3 weeks into Project Mirror, Officer Reeves stood on a street corner in the West Side neighborhood, dressed in jeans and a plain blue t-shirt. Without his uniform, badge, and cruiser, he felt strangely exposed. Next to him stood David, a community volunteer who'd grown up in this area. They were shadowing Officer Chen today, watching how she handled routine calls. "See how she approached that group of teens," David pointed out. Hand on her weapon, stance wide, voice raised before she even asked a question. Reeves nodded, seeing the interaction through new eyes. The teenagers, just hanging out near a convenience store, immediately stiffened when Chen approached. Their body language shifted from relaxed to defensive in seconds. "That's how fights start," David said quietly. "Nobody likes being treated like they're guilty of something when they're just living their life." Reeves thought back to his approach with Dr. Johnson, hand on holster, accusatory tone. He'd done exactly the same thing, hadn't realized how threatening it looked from the other side. The Project Mirror sessions had grown increasingly intense over the past weeks. After the community panel, Dr. Johnson had arranged ride-alongs where the officers, dressed as civilians, observed their colleagues at work. They'd attended community meetings where residents spoke freely about their fears and frustrations with police. They'd reviewed body camera footage of their own stops, analyzing their language and behavior with community members providing commentary. It was exhausting, uncomfortable work. 2 officers had dropped out. Baker complained to the union, while Thompson requested a transfer to another precinct. But Reeves had stayed, along with Gonzalez, Chen, and Wilson. Something about Dr. Johnson's approach had gotten under his skin. She never attacked or accused. She simply showed them the impact of their actions and asked questions that made them think. "Officer Reeves?" David's voice pulled him back to the present. "You okay? You looked lost in thought." Just thinking about how differently Officer Chen could have handled that, Reeves admitted. There was no need to approach those kids like they were armed suspects. David nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You know, when Dr. Johnson first told me about this project, I thought she was wasting her time. Cops don't change, that's what I always believed." "And now?" Reeves asked. David shrugged. "Let's just say I'm reserving judgment." That afternoon, the Project Mirror group gathered in the conference room for their daily debrief. Dr. Johnson sat at the head of the table, listening as the officers discussed what they'd observed. "I watched Diaz handle a traffic stop today," Gonzalez reported. "Guy ran a stop sign, nothing serious. But Diaz had him spread-eagled against the car within 30 seconds. Turned out he was a high school math teacher late for a faculty meeting." "What would you have done differently?" Dr. Johnson asked. Gonzalez thought for a moment. "Asked for license and registration first, assessed the situation. The guy was wearing a shirt and tie, for crying out loud. He wasn't a threat." "But officers can't judge by appearances," Wilson argued. "That's the whole point, isn't it? Anyone could be dangerous." "True," Dr. Johnson acknowledged. "But there's a difference between being cautious and being unnecessarily aggressive. We escalate situations that could be handled calmly." The discussion continued, more heated than usual. These officers were beginning to question practices they'd taken for granted throughout their careers. It wasn't easy letting go of old habits and beliefs. After the meeting, Dr. Johnson asked Reeves to stay behind. "I have an assignment for you," she said, handing him a folder. "Tomorrow, you'll be partnered with Officer Washington in the East Side District." Reeves flipped through the folder. Washington. Isn't he that rookie just out of the academy? 6 months on the job, Dr. Johnson confirmed. And he has 0 civilian complaints so far. I want you to observe how he interacts with the community. The next day, Reeves found himself in a patrol car with Officer Washington, a soft-spoken man in his mid-20s. Their shift started quietly, with routine traffic stops and a call about a shoplifter at a local grocery store. Washington handled each situation with a calm, respectful demeanor that Reeves found both impressive and slightly irritating. When they detained the teenage shoplifter, Washington spoke to him firmly but kindly, without handcuffs or threats. "You let him off easy," Reeves commented as they drove away. "Kid stole $50 worth of food." Washington glanced over. His grandmother is raising him and 4 siblings on Social Security. They run out of food at the end of the month sometimes. I've been connecting them with the food bank and community resources. How do you know all that? I ask questions. I listen to the answers. Washington shrugged. Most people in this neighborhood aren't criminals. They're just trying to get by. My job is to help when I can and enforce the law when I must. Reeves fell silent, thinking about his own approach to policing. How many times had he assumed the worst about people based on their neighborhood, their appearance, or the cars they drove? How many Dr. Johnsons had he pulled over, people who were just living their lives until he decided they looked suspicious? As their shift ended, Washington parked at a basketball court where a group of kids were playing. He grabbed a ball from the trunk and joined them for a few minutes, laughing and shooting hoops while still in uniform. "You do this often?" Reeves asked when Washington returned to the car. "Every shift," Washington replied. "Can't build trust if they only see you making arrests." He studied Reeves for a moment. "That's what Project Mirror is about, isn't it? Seeing the job differently?" Reeves nodded slowly. "I'm starting to." 6 months after the traffic stop that changed everything, Officer James Reeves stood nervously in the hallway outside the main conference room at police headquarters. Inside, the chief of police, the mayor, and the entire command staff were gathered for a special presentation on community policing. Dr. Johnson had asked Reeves to be part of it, and despite his initial reluctance, he'd agreed. "You ready for this?" Dr. Johnson appeared beside him, looking sharp in a charcoal gray suit. "Not really," Reeves admitted, adjusting his tie. "Public speaking isn't exactly my strong suit." "Just speak from experience," she said. "That's all anyone can ask." They entered the conference room together. The buzz of conversation died down as heads turned to watch them walk to the front. Reeves recognized faces from every level of the department, along with city officials and community leaders. His mouth went dry. The police chief stepped up to the podium first. "As you know, 6 months ago, Dr. Johnson launched Project Mirror as a pilot program to address patterns of biased policing within our department. Today, we'll hear about the results directly from those involved." Dr. Johnson took the podium. "Thank you, Chief. When I joined this department as head of internal affairs, I could have taken the traditional approach, discipline officers, fire the worst offenders, and hope the problem would go away. But decades of evidence show that approach doesn't create lasting change." She clicked to the first slide, showing a graph of civilian complaints over the past 6 months. Project Mirror took a different approach. Instead of punishing officers for biased practices, we gave them the opportunity to see policing from the community's perspective. She explained the program's components, the community panels, the ride-alongs in plainclothes, the mentoring with officers who practiced community-centered policing. Throughout her presentation, Reeves found himself nodding along, remembering each uncomfortable but illuminating experience. "The results speak for themselves," Dr. Johnson continued, highlighting a 47% decrease in civilian complaints against officers who completed the program. But numbers only tell part of the story. To understand the human impact, I'd like to introduce Officer James Reeves. A murmur went through the crowd as Reeves approached the podium. Many knew he'd been the officer who stopped Dr. Johnson that fateful day. Others had heard rumors about his history of complaints. Reeves cleared his throat, looking down at his prepared notes before setting them aside. 6 months ago, I pulled over Dr. Johnson because she was driving a nice car in an upscale neighborhood, and to be honest, because she didn't look like she belonged there. He paused, meeting the eyes of community members in the audience. I didn't use those words, even to myself. I called it instinct or experience or just doing my job. But the truth is, I saw a black woman driving through Oakwood Heights, and I assumed something was wrong. He described how his attitude had changed when he discovered who she was. In that moment, Dr. Johnson could have reported me, demanded my badge, made an example of me. Instead, she offered me a chance to see my actions through a different lens. Reeves spoke about his journey through Project Mirror, the initial defensiveness, the growing awareness, the uncomfortable realizations about his own behavior. He described his day with Officer Washington and how it had changed his approach to patrol. "Last week, I was driving through West Side when I spotted a teenager running down the street. 6 months ago, I would have immediately detained him, assuming he was fleeing a crime scene. Instead, I slowed down and called out to ask if he needed help. Reeves smiled slightly at the memory. Turns out his little sister had wandered off, and he was frantically searching for her. We found her 3 blocks away, playing in a neighbor's yard. The room was silent as he continued. I've been a cop for 12 years. I always thought my job was to catch bad guys. Now I understand that my real job is to serve the community, all of the community, not just the parts that look like me or live where I live. Dr. Johnson returned to the podium after Reeves finished. Project Mirror is now being expanded to a department-wide training program. Every officer will participate, from rookies to veterans. But training alone isn't enough. We're also implementing new policies. She outlined changes to performance evaluations, complaint procedures, and community oversight. The goal isn't to make policing softer or less effective, it's to make it more just and more trusted. When communities trust their police, everyone is safer, including the officers serving those communities. After the presentation, the police chief announced the formation of a community bridge unit dedicated to building relationships in neighborhoods with historically high tension with police. And I'm pleased to announce that Officer Reeves has volunteered to lead this new unit. As the meeting broke up, Reeves found himself surrounded by colleagues offering congratulations and community members expressing cautious optimism. Captain Rivera clapped him on the shoulder. When Dr. Johnson first told me about her plans for you, I thought she was crazy. Now I'm thinking she might be the smartest person in the department. Later, as the room emptied, Reeves found himself alone with Dr. Johnson. Thank you, he said simply, for not ending my career when you had the chance. I didn't save your career, Officer Reeves, she replied. You did that yourself by being willing to change. Not everyone is. Reeves thought about Baker and Thompson, who'd refused to complete Project Mirror. Both were now facing disciplinary action for new complaints. There's still a lot of work to do, Dr. Johnson said, gathering her materials. One officer at a time, one interaction at a time. She paused at the door. See you tomorrow, Officer Reeves. We have a community meeting in Oakwood Heights. I think you'll find it interesting to be back there under different circumstances. As Reeves walked to his car, he noticed a black teenage boy watching him from across the street. Instead of assuming the worst or ignoring him, Reeves nodded in greeting. The boy hesitated, then nodded back, a small gesture, but the beginning of something important. Change wouldn't happen overnight. Trust, once broken, took time to rebuild. But for the first time in his career, Officer James Reeves understood that his badge wasn't just a symbol of authority, it was a promise to serve everyone with equal respect and dignity. It had taken an unexpected traffic stop and an extraordinary woman to show him that truth. Now it was his job to live it every day.